Okay, so this section is on encapsulation, and we kind of like looked at in the previous section local, encapsulated, global, and built-in scopes. We sort of mentioned them, and we showed this example where we had the global scope, which is outside of the function, and the local scope that's inside of a function. So what we're going to do in this particular section is just extend that a tiny bit to show like effectively a variant of encapsulation at least. It's also called nested functions because we're going to like nest functions. So we're going to set this variable a, and we're going to say that this is, we're just going to assign it to the, we're going to create a string and assign it to the variable a. We're going to call it the global scope, right, which is outside of functions. Outside of any functions that we're going to create. And the next thing we're going to do is create a function. So we're going to define a function, and we could just leave it as, we'll call it outer function. We'll call it outer function. So we'll define a function, we'll call it outer function, and then we're going to set a variable inside of that a again, because we want to use the same variable just to show that a is going to be something different, and we're just going to assign it to the string here. So, and we're going to call this the outer function. And then inside of this function, we are going to create another function. So we're going to go def function, and this time we're going to call it the inner function. So something like this. And again, we will assign, we'll create another variable, and we'll assign it the value of the inner function. Now, if we run this at the moment, nothing's going to happen because we're not printing anything. So the first thing we might want to do is print the value of a. And the question is what are we going to get for the value of a? And we're expecting now to get this value because it's in the global scope, and this a here is not seen outside of its scope, and the other a is not seen outside of its scope as well. So when we do that one, we do get the outer function. Now it's kind of like, how do we get the a inside the inner function? So let's kind of like create a print statement here. Print a, but in order to get it, like, this function at the moment is not being called, so what we'd need to do is call the outer function. So we need to run my outer function like this, and that will print the value of a here, which is the outer function. So we're seeing that these, even though the variables have the same names, when they're effectively like encapsulated or different nested levels, they don't see each other. So, and then finally, if we wanted to print the inner value, again we'd have to have a print statement here. So print, and then a again, but this has not yet been called, and we've got to be careful about where we call it as well. So we want to call this function, and we want to call it from, and we've got to call it from inside the outer function. So if we tried to call it from our global scope, so we try to call my inner, we can already see that inner doesn't exist here. It's not going to find it. So we can only see at the global scope, we can only see my outer function here. We can see my function. I think I created something called my function somewhere, but we can see only my outer function. That's the only one that we're able to see. We can't see the my inner function. But when we're inside of our outer function, we can call it. Now, just be careful about one thing. Python works in indentation, and if we go here, then we still look like we're inside of, because we're indented at the same level as the code block inside the inner function. So when we go back one level of indentation, we're now inside the outer function, and we can call my inner function. And you see, like, it comes up straight away in the drop down list, so it's available. So my inner function, and that should print a. So we're calling my inner function there, and it will then print A. So, and it's going to print A actually straight away from my outer function. Now, we've got the global scope, we've got an outer function, and we've got an inner function. I was just wondering if we could change the order of that, in terms of, can we call the inner function first? But we'd have to, well, we could do, so we've got an option here, like we could switch these around in terms of, we could move this print A over to this part here to print it just outside of it. And what I might do actually is print A again then, basically. So print A, but we'll call it like, for example, just part 2, just to show that we could actually have the outer function being called before or after the, or at least the print statement from the outer function being called before or after the inner function if we wanted to. So we could have that as well. This is sort of like optional, like just as a little side extra example. But this basically shows encapsulation is showing it in a way through nested functions. This is the nested function here. We call this the nested function or the inner function, and we call this function here the outer function. And the outer function lies in the global scope, so everything here is in the global scope. And this function here is effectively encapsulated. We could say it's encapsulated. It certainly is nested inside the outer functions. We've got an inner, and we could keep performing levels of nesting. Obviously, it would get a little bit confusing, and I've not really seen a case where there's nesting inside of nesting. If you did see that, it'd probably be a red flag. But yeah, that's generally it, and that's really how encapsulation works. So we've looked at like the local scope, the encapsulated scope, and the global scope, and the last one to look at really is the built-in scope, and they are the built-in functions. But we'll look at them, or at least we'll consider them, but the built-in functions are something separate because they're the functions that we kind of like get. So for example here, this function here, sum, is a built-in function. We didn't have to define it or declare it, and so that's one scope kind of like outside of the global scope, which we will look at in a different video. So that's it. That's really how scopes work.